I never thought I'd be the kind of man to let things slip so far. But I guess we all think that at some point, don't we? My name's Mike, and I've been married to Laura for nearly a decade. We've got a son, Ben, who's 8, and for the longest time, I thought we had it all figured out. But nothing is ever as smooth as it looks on the outside. It wasn't the first time I'd felt her slipping away. Laura had always been focused, independent. That's what drew me to her in the first place. But after a while, that same independence started feeling like distance. She worked late, went out more, and when she was home, it felt like she was somewhere else. Not too long ago, she told me she wanted to take up teaching piano again, something she loved before Ben was born. I didn't think much of it at the time. I figured she just needed a hobby, something to get her out of the house while I was at work. But then there was the lighter. A small, black, nondescript thing, lying on the edge of the bed. Laura doesn't smoke, never has. I don't smoke either. I found it while I was changing the sheets, and for some reason, it stuck in my mind. Who leaves a lighter in a place like that if they don't smoke? I remember staring at it, my thoughts racing in a million directions. I ended up tossing it in the trash, convincing myself it was nothing. Maybe it fell out of someone's pocket, a friend who had come over, or something. Laura wasn't the type to cheat. Not her. Except, I wasn't entirely innocent either. Not that long ago, I had my own little moment of weakness, if you can call it that. It was a corporate event, one of those cheesy, booze-filled nights on a boat, celebrating another deal closed. I met a woman, Kate, and, well, one thing led to another. It didn't mean anything. A few drinks, a few poor decisions, and it was over. I told myself it was just a stupid mistake and buried it deep. I never thought about it much after that. But sometimes, I wonder if things started changing after that night. Maybe some guilt is harder to shake than we realize. Things were normal between Laura and me, or so I thought. We had our fights, sure, but what couple doesn't after years together? But recently, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Her kisses were short, distracted. Our conversations, once filled with jokes and banter, were reduced to mundane updates about Ben, groceries, or bills. The spark was gone, and I wasn't sure why. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, Laura came home late from one of her piano lessons. She smelled different, not like perfume, but something else. It was faint, but it hit me. I didn't ask her about it, though. I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Instead, I pretended everything was fine, just like I always did. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept tossing and turning, imagining her with someone else. Could she be cheating? Was that lighter a clue? My mind wouldn't shut up. I needed answers, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I decided to keep my suspicions to myself and observe. I figured if something was really going on, it wouldn't stay hidden forever. And sure enough, a few days later, I found another clue. It was subtle, but unmistakable. Laura had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered. We never used to have secrets between us, and we'd always left our phones unlocked. But when I tried to check hers, it was locked with a password. A password? That had never happened before. My stomach turned. Why would she lock her phone unless she was hiding something? I debated with myself for hours, pacing back and forth, my mind spiraling. Should I ask her? Should I confront her? What if I was wrong? What if I was just paranoid because of my own past? But something deep inside me, a nagging voice, told me there was more to this. Something wasn't right. That night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. After she came out of the shower, I casually asked her about the phone. Hey, Laura, did you change your phone password? She paused, just for a second, before answering. Oh, yeah. I had some issues with spam calls, and the phone company recommended it. Her explanation seemed too smooth, too rehearsed. But I let it slide. I nodded, pretending to believe her. But deep down, I knew. Something was wrong. Something was happening behind my back, and I was going to find out what. Part 2, The Discovery. A few weeks passed, and the feeling of suspicion kept growing. Laura became more distant, more evasive. Every time I asked about her piano lessons or her schedule, she gave short, generic answers. It was fine. Same as usual. Nothing new. It was like talking to a wall. Meanwhile, I was constantly on edge, trying to pick up on any clues, any hints that would confirm what I feared. One Friday evening, Laura told me she had a late piano lesson and wouldn't be home until after 10. Ben was at my mom's place for the weekend, so I had the house to myself. Normally, I would have enjoyed the quiet, but that night, my mind was racing. I couldn't stop thinking about where she really was. An idea struck me. I knew Laura had synced her phone to our shared computer a while back. Maybe, just maybe, there would be something there, an email, a message, something to explain what was going on. I opened the laptop and started searching, scrolling through files and folders. My heart pounded in my chest as I clicked through her synced apps. And then I saw it, an email she had forgotten to delete from her outbox. The subject line read, "Can't wait to see you." My heart dropped. I clicked it open, and there it was, the confirmation I dreaded. It was a message from her to someone named Roman. The email wasn't explicit, but it didn't have to be. The words were enough: "I've been thinking about you all day. Can't wait to be in your arms tonight." Tonight. While she was supposed to be at her piano lesson. I sat there, staring at the screen, numb. So it was true. She was cheating on me, just like I'd feared. But instead of feeling angry or betrayed, all I felt was emptiness. I had done the same thing to her once, hadn't I? Maybe this was karma coming back to bite me. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I sat there staring at the screen, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Her words to this man, Roman, swirled in my mind. "Can't wait to be in your arms tonight." It was a simple sentence, but it carried a weight that crushed me. All those nights she had been teaching piano, were they all lies? I didn't know what to do next. My hands trembled over the keyboard as I read the email again and again, hoping that somehow the words would change or disappear. But they didn't. They were real, and so was the betrayal. It's strange how your mind can go blank in a moment of crisis. I should have been furious, or maybe devastated, but instead, I was stuck in a fog, unable to process it all. The irony wasn't lost on me: I had betrayed her once, too. But this felt different. When I cheated with Kate, it was a stupid, meaningless fling, a drunken mistake. I never planned to do it again, never wanted to. But this felt like something deeper, something I didn't understand yet. I thought about calling her out right then and there, but I hesitated. What would I even say? That I snooped through her synced emails and found out she was seeing someone else? No, it wasn't the right time for a confrontation. I needed more proof. I needed to be sure. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there, listening to every creak and shift in the house, waiting for her to come home. It was after midnight when I finally heard the front door open and her footsteps quietly tiptoe into the bedroom. I kept my eyes closed, feigning sleep. She slipped into bed next to me, her movements careful, as if she was afraid of waking me. Her body didn't touch mine, she stayed on her side of the bed, and the space between us felt like a chasm. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything. But I didn't. My mind was racing, and the weight of her betrayal sat like a rock on my chest. How long had this been going on? How many times had she come home late like this, lying about piano lessons or errands? And who the hell was Roman? The next few days were a blur. Laura continued her routine as if nothing was wrong, but now, everything she did felt suspicious. She smiled at me, kissed me goodbye, talked about our son, but all I could think about was her affair. I became obsessed with finding out more, watching her every move, paying attention to every detail, every word she said. One evening, after Ben had gone to bed, I casually brought up her lessons. "How's the piano teaching going?" I asked, pretending to be interested. She barely looked up from her book. "Good, busy as usual." "Any new students?" I pressed, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "Not really. Same ones." "Why?" She glanced at me, her expression neutral. I shrugged, trying to act casual. "Just curious. You seem to be spending a lot of time on it lately." She hesitated for a split second, then smiled. "Yeah, it keeps me busy. But I love it, you know that." Her smile didn't reach her eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. She was lying to me, again. And I didn't know how much longer I could play along. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something more. Waiting around for her to slip up wasn't enough. I needed to take action. So, the next day, when Laura left for one of her lessons, I decided to follow her. I've never done anything like that before, and I felt sick with guilt as I drove a few blocks behind her car, staying far enough back that she wouldn't notice. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, and my mind raced with all the possible scenarios I might encounter. She drove across town, passing the area where her usual students lived. My heart sank as she pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe, far from any piano studios. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she stepped out of the car, looking around nervously before walking inside. I waited, my pulse pounding in my ears. I don't know what I expected to happen next, but after a few minutes, I saw him, Roman. Tall, dark-haired, and wearing a casual jacket, he greeted her with a smile, and they embraced. It wasn't a quick hug between friends, it was something more. Something intimate. I felt my stomach drop as I watched them sit down at a table by the window, their bodies angled toward each other, their heads close as they talked. Laura was laughing, her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. She was completely absorbed in him, her attention fully on Roman, as if nothing else in the world existed. I wanted to storm in there, to confront them both, to demand answers. But instead, I stayed in the car, frozen. What good would it do to go in there now? I already had my answer. She was cheating on me, and she didn't even have the decency to hide it anymore. My mind reeled with the implications. Was she planning to leave me? Was she in love with this guy? How long had this been going on, and how had I been so blind? The cafe meeting only lasted about an hour. Afterward, they left together, walking to his car parked in the lot next to hers. They stood there for a moment, talking, before she kissed him, softly, deliberately. It wasn't a goodbye kiss, it was a kiss that held promise, desire. As they drove off in separate directions, I felt a mixture of rage and despair boiling inside me. I knew I couldn't keep quiet any longer. I had to confront her, to get the truth out of her once and for all. But I also needed to prepare myself for what was coming. Whatever happened next, nothing in our lives would ever be the same. Her words hit me like a freight train. Laura knew. She had known about Kate the whole time, and yet, she never said a word. My mind raced, trying to piece together how she could have found out. I had been so careful. It was just one night, nothing more than a stupid, drunken mistake that I thought I'd buried. But there it was, out in the open, hanging between us like a storm cloud ready to burst. You knew. I managed to choke out, my voice barely above a whisper. Laura's gaze was steady, cold. Of course, I knew. Did you really think you could hide something like that from me? I didn't know what to say. My chest tightened as the guilt I'd tried so hard to suppress over the past year came flooding back. I'd never wanted her to find out, never wanted to hurt her like this. But now, standing here in our living room, it was clear that the damage had already been done. So, what? This, I gestured wildly toward her, my voice rising. This is payback. You're screwing around with Roman because I made a mistake. Laura crossed her arms, her expression hardening. It's not that simple, Mike. Then explain it to me, I snapped, my frustration boiling over. Make me understand why you're cheating on me, why you're sneaking around behind my back after everything we've been through. She sighed, running a hand through her hair. It wasn't about revenge. Not at first. I didn't start seeing Roman because of what you did, but after what happened with Kate, something changed between us. You shut me out. You pretended like nothing happened, but I could feel it. I could feel the distance growing. Her words hit hard because they were true. After my night with Kate, I had tried to push the guilt away, tried to pretend that everything was fine. But it wasn't. The distance between us had grown slowly, like a crack in a windshield that you barely notice until one day, it shatters. I just didn't realize how deep that crack had gone. Laura took a deep breath and continued, her voice softer now. I was lonely, Mike. I felt like you didn't care anymore, like you were just going through the motions. And then I met Roman. There it was, his name again, that infuriating name. My fists clenched at my sides as she spoke, every word driving the knife deeper. It started off innocent, she said, her eyes glazing over as if she was remembering. He was a student at one of my piano lessons, and we just clicked. He listened to me, made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't about you at first. I didn't want to hurt you. But then, one day, it crossed the line, and after that, I couldn't stop. My heart pounded in my ears as I tried to process what she was saying. She had fallen for him. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The thought of her opening up to another man, sharing the parts of herself that I thought belonged to me, made my stomach churn. So, what now? I asked, my voice hollow. Are you leaving me for him? Laura shook her head quickly, her expression conflicted. I don't know. I don't know what I want. Roman, he's different. But this, she waved her hand between us, this is our life, Mike. We have a son. We have history. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, but it did nothing to ease the ache in my chest. She wasn't sure if she wanted to leave me. She wasn't sure if Roman was worth tearing our family apart for. And that uncertainty cut deeper than any confession of love for someone else ever could. I sank into the nearest chair, my head in my hands, the weight of it all pressing down on me. I can't believe this is happening, I muttered, more to myself than to her. Laura stepped closer, her voice softening. I never wanted it to get this far. I didn't plan on hurting you. But after everything that happened, after what you did, I don't know how to come back from that. We've both made mistakes. Mistakes. That word felt so inadequate to describe what had happened between us. But she was right, neither of us was innocent. I had started this downward spiral, and now we were both caught in its wake, unsure of how to pull ourselves out. Mike, she said gently, kneeling down in front of me. I don't want to lose you. But I don't know if we can fix this. Do you? I lifted my head and looked at her, really looked at her. For the first time in years, I saw the weariness in her eyes, the cracks in her armor. She was hurting just as much as I was, and that realization left me speechless. The anger that had fueled me moments ago began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of sadness. I don't know, I finally admitted, my voice barely audible. I don't know if we can. We sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of our shared betrayal hanging over us like a dark cloud. I wanted to believe that we could fix this, that we could somehow find our way back to the way things used to be. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was even possible anymore. Too much had been broken, too much had been lost. As the night dragged on, we barely spoke. Laura stayed on her side of the bed, and I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. How did we get here? How had we let it come to this? And then, just as I was about to drift off to sleep, I heard it, her phone buzzing softly on the nightstand. I glanced over, seeing Roman's name flash across the screen, and my heart sank all over again. She hadn't stopped. Even after everything we'd just talked about, she was still in contact with him. That was the moment I knew. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Laura was still in this thing with Roman, and if I wanted to save what was left of our marriage, I had to take control. I had to find a way to stop this. But how? I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew one thing for certain: if I didn't act soon, would lose her for good. That evening, as Laura walked through the front door, I felt a sense of anticipation that made my heart race. She was tired, her shoulders slumped, but there was no sign of guilt or nervousness in her face. How could she be so calm after everything that had come out between us? Maybe she was just better at hiding her feelings than I was, or maybe she had already made her choice. But I wasn't about to let her go without a fight. "Hey," I said, my voice softer than usual. I stood up from the couch, trying to appear casual, as if nothing monumental had happened between us the night before. "I thought we could talk tonight. About us. About everything." She hesitated in the doorway, her hand lingering on her purse strap as if she wasn't sure whether she should stay or leave. But then, she nodded and stepped inside, letting the door close softly behind her. "Okay," she said, her voice cautious. I gestured to the table, where I had laid out a few old photo albums. "I was going through some things today, remembering when we were younger. I thought maybe we could take a walk down memory lane. You know, remind ourselves of what we've been through together." Laura's eyes flickered toward the albums, and for a moment, I saw something pass across her face: nostalgia, maybe. Or was it regret? Either way, she walked over and sat down at the table, looking at the photos spread out before her. I sat down across from her, my hands resting on the edges of the album. "Do you remember this one?" I asked, pointing to a picture of us on a beach in Mexico, from our honeymoon. Laura was in a bright blue swimsuit, laughing as the waves crashed over her legs. I was standing behind her, my arms wrapped around her waist, both of us smiling like we had nothing in the world to worry about. Laura smiled faintly. "Yeah, I remember. That was a good trip." "It was," I agreed, my voice soft. "We were happy. Really happy. And we've had so many good times since then, haven't we?" She didn't answer right away, her fingers tracing the edge of the photo. "Yeah," she said after a moment. "We've had our moments." I swallowed hard. I know things have been rough lately. I know I haven't been the best husband, and I'm sorry for that. I'm sorry for Kate, for what I did. I never wanted to hurt you, Laura. She looked up at me, her expression unreadable. "It's not just about Kate, Mike. It's everything. The way things have been between us for the past few years. The way we've grown apart. It wasn't just your mistake." "I know," I said quickly. "I know I've let things slip. But we can fix this, Laura. We can get back to what we had. Don't you think it's worth trying?" Her silence spoke volumes. She stared down at the photo album, her face pensive, and I could see the conflict in her eyes. She wasn't sure. She didn't know if we could fix things, or if she even wanted to try. "Look," I said, leaning forward, my voice urgent. "I know you've been seeing Roman. I know you've been thinking about leaving, and I get it. But Laura, what we have, it's more than just some fling. We have a life together. We have a son. Doesn't that mean something to you?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a moment, I saw a flash of guilt. "Of course, it does. Mike, I never wanted this to happen. I never wanted things to get this far. Then don't let it, I said, my voice cracking. Don't let him come between us. I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. I'll go to counseling. I'll be better. But I can't do it alone, Laura. I need you to meet me halfway. She sighed, her hands rubbing her temples. It's not that simple, Mike. It can be, I said, my desperation growing. It can be if we both want it. Laura shook her head, her eyes downcast. I don't know if I can just shut off what I feel for him. It's not that easy. The words sliced through me like a knife. I'd hoped, somehow, that she'd admit it was just a passing thing, a mistake like mine had been. But hearing her say that she had real feelings for him, feelings she wasn't sure she could walk away from, was a new kind of pain I wasn't prepared for. I pushed the photo album aside, my hands gripping the edge of the table. You can't seriously be thinking of throwing all of this away. For him. For some guy you've known for, what, a year? It's not about the time, Mike, she said quietly. It's about how he makes me feel. And I haven't felt like that with you in a long time. I felt my throat tighten, my chest constricting. We can get that back, I pleaded. We can find that again. Her gaze softened, but there was something resigned in her eyes. I don't know if we can. I don't know if I even want to try. I sat back in my chair, the weight of her words pressing down on me like a boulder. All the hope, all the plans I had made for saving our marriage, suddenly felt futile. She wasn't sure if she wanted to save it. And that terrified me. What about Ben? I asked, my voice trembling. You're willing to break up our family over this? Laura's face crumpled, and I could see the pain in her eyes. No, of course not. I don't want to hurt him. But staying together just for Ben, that's not fair to any of us. He'll see that we're not happy. He's not stupid. I stood up from the table, pacing the room in frustration. I couldn't believe this was happening. We were on the verge of losing everything, and I was powerless to stop it. Mike, Laura said softly, standing up and walking over to me. I don't want to make any rash decisions. I need time to think. I stopped pacing and looked at her. What does that mean? It means I need space, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I need to figure out what I want. And I think you do too. I stared at her, my mind racing. You're leaving. I think it's best if I stay with my sister for a while, she said quietly. Just until we can both clear our heads. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. This was it, the beginning of the end. She was leaving me. And there was nothing I could do to stop her. When? I asked, my voice barely audible. Tomorrow, she said. I'll take Ben to your mom's for the weekend, and I'll go stay with Rachel. I need some time, Mike. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The lump in my throat made it impossible to speak. I'll pack a few things, she said, brushing past me toward the bedroom. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of what was happening began to sink in. Laura was leaving. And for the first time, I realized that I might not be able to fix this. I might not be able to get her back. The following morning felt surreal. Laura moved around the house quietly, packing her things while I sat on the couch, staring blankly at the TV. The silence between us was deafening, a stark contrast to the noise in my head. It was hard to wrap my mind around the fact that she was actually leaving, even if it was just for a while. Deep down, I feared it wasn't temporary, that this was the start of something permanent. Ben, of course, had no idea what was really going on. Laura had explained that he'd be spending the weekend with Grandma, and he seemed excited about it. He packed up his things like it was just another sleepover, completely unaware of the storm brewing between his parents. When Laura dropped him off at my mom's, I stayed behind. I couldn't face the questions my mom might ask, the awkwardness of pretending everything was fine. I didn't want to lie, but I also wasn't ready to explain. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When Laura returned from the drop-off, she grabbed her final bag from the bedroom. She avoided looking directly at me, her movements brisk and efficient as she prepared to walk out the door. "Do you really have to go?" The words came out before I could stop them. I sounded desperate, and I hated it. Laura paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. She didn't turn around. "I think it's for the best, Mike. We both need time to figure this out." "And what if I don't want time?" I said, standing up from the couch, my voice sharper than I intended. "What if I want to figure this out together, here, now?" She turned then, her eyes full of sadness. "I can't think straight when we're in the same house, when you're watching my every move. I need space, Mike. And you do too." I wanted to argue, to beg her to stay, but I knew it would only push her further away. She was already halfway out the door, not just physically but emotionally. If I pressed too hard, she'd be gone for good. So, I swallowed my pride and nodded. "Fine," I muttered, sitting back down. "Do what you have to do." Her lips parted as if she wanted to say something more, but instead, she just nodded once and walked out, the door clicking softly behind her. And just like that, she was gone. The house felt impossibly empty after she left. It was strange, really, how the absence of one person could make a place that had once been full of life feel like a hollow shell. I wandered from room to room, trying to distract myself with mundane tasks, washing dishes, organizing the living room, anything to keep my mind off the growing ache in my chest. But nothing worked. Eventually, I ended up in our bedroom, staring at the neatly made bed where we had once slept side by side, where we had shared our lives, our dreams, and now, our secrets. I couldn't stay in that room, not with the weight of her absence pressing down on me, so I grabbed my keys and left the house, not knowing where I was going but needing to get out. I drove aimlessly for a while, the roads blurring together as my thoughts swirled. I kept replaying our last conversation, wondering if there was something I could have said or done differently, something that might have kept her from walking out the door. But every scenario I ran through led back to the same conclusion: we were broken, and I didn't know how to fix us. Before I knew it, I found myself parked outside the cafe where I'd seen Laura and Roman together. The sight of it made my stomach churn, but I couldn't look away. This was where it all began, where she had found something with him that she no longer found with me. I hated this place, hated everything it represented. But at the same time, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that this was where Laura had been happy, where she had smiled and laughed in a way that I hadn't seen in years. Without thinking, I got out of the car and walked inside. The cafe was quiet, only a handful of customers scattered throughout the room, sipping their coffees or typing on laptops. I ordered a drink and sat at a table near the window, my eyes scanning the room as if I might find some clue, some answer to the questions swirling in my mind. But of course, there was nothing. Just a bunch of strangers living their lives, completely unaware of the turmoil that had brought me here. As I sipped my coffee, I noticed a couple sitting a few tables away, their heads bent close together as they whispered and laughed. The sight of them hit me like a punch to the gut. It was almost too much to bear, watching someone else experience the connection that I had lost. I looked away, focusing on the street outside, but the image of them lingered, gnawing at me. I thought about Roman again, about how he must have made Laura feel to pull her so far away from me. What did he have that I didn't? Was it just timing, the right place at the right moment when she was feeling vulnerable? Or was it something deeper, something I had failed to give her? The thought made me sick. I had spent so much time blaming her for the affair, for sneaking around behind my back, but now I couldn't help but wonder if I had been the one who had pushed her away. Maybe it wasn't just about Roman. Maybe it was about me. About the man I had become, the man who had let his own mistake with Kate fester until it rotted everything between us. I finished my coffee and left the cafe, the weight of those thoughts pressing down on me like a ton of bricks. As I drove home, I realized I wasn't just angry at Laura anymore. I was angry at myself, too, angry that I had let things get this far, that I had let our marriage crumble without even realizing it. When I got home, I headed straight to the bedroom. I knew Laura had taken most of her things, but I needed to see what she had left behind. I opened her closet, finding it half empty, with only a few hangers and old clothes still lingering. I felt a lump form in my throat as I ran my hand along the clothes she hadn't bothered to pack. In the corner of the closet, I spotted a small box, something I hadn't noticed before. It was buried under some old scarves and shoes. Curious, I pulled it out and opened it. Inside were small keepsakes, things I hadn't seen in years, old letters, photos, ticket stubs from concerts and vacations we had taken together. But there was something else, tucked underneath everything, a small journal. I flipped through the pages, recognizing Laura's handwriting immediately. Most of it was filled with day-to-day musings, thoughts about work, about Ben, about life in general. But as I got further along, the entries became more personal, more raw. I began reading, my heart pounding as I saw what she had written over the last few months. She had written about Roman. The entries weren't explicit, but they were enough to paint a clear picture. She wrote about how she felt alive when she was with him, how he made her laugh, how he listened to her in a way that I hadn't in years. And then there was the entry that stopped me cold. I think I love him. I dropped the journal onto the bed, my hands trembling. That was it. That was the confirmation I had been dreading. She didn't just care about him, she loved him. And with that, everything I had been holding on to, the hope that we could fix this, the belief that maybe she just needed time, came crashing down around me. She loved him. And there was no coming back from that. The journal lay on the bed like a bomb waiting to go off. I stared at it for what felt like hours, though it could have only been minutes. The words, "I think I love him," echoed in my mind, a painful mantra I couldn't escape. There was something about seeing it written down, in her own handwriting, that made it all too real. This wasn't just a fleeting affair. It was deeper than that. It was something I couldn't compete with, something I couldn't fix with an apology or a few shared memories. She loved him. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought I might be sick. All the fight drained out of me, leaving me hollow. I'd been clinging to the hope that we could work things out, that maybe this was just a phase, a mistake she would regret. But this was different. Love was final. Love wasn't something you could just brush off and walk away from. I stood up from the bed, pacing the room, trying to wrap my head around what I had just read. How long had she felt this way? How long had she been falling for him while I was sitting here, clueless, thinking we could still save our marriage? I felt like a fool. I stopped in front of the mirror, staring at my own reflection. I didn't recognize the man looking back at me. He looked tired, beaten down, a shadow of who he used to be. Somewhere along the way, I had lost myself, just as much as I had lost Laura. I had become someone I didn't even like, someone who had cheated on his wife, who had pushed her away without even realizing it. No wonder she had found someone else. But that didn't make it hurt any less. I needed to talk to her. I needed to hear her say it, to admit what I already knew. Maybe I was masochistic, but I couldn't just leave it like this. I grabbed my phone and dialed her number before I could second-guess myself. She answered after a few rings, her voice hesitant. "Mike?" "Yeah," I said, my voice thick. "We need to talk." There was a pause, then a sigh. "I figured you'd say that. I'm at Rachel's, but I can come by if you want." "Yeah. Come by." I hung up before she could say anything else. The drive back to our house must have been short, but it felt like a lifetime. Every second dragged as I sat in the living room, waiting for her. My mind raced with 1,000 questions, but one stood out above the rest: what happens next? When Laura finally arrived, she looked tired, too. Her eyes were red, as if she'd been crying, and she walked in with her arms crossed, defensive, guarded. "Hey," she said softly, standing awkwardly near the door. "Hey," I replied, motioning for her to sit. She hesitated for a moment, then sat down across from me, her body language tense. "I found your journal," I said, my voice flat. I didn't want to play games or beat around the bush. "I read what you wrote about him." Laura closed her eyes, her shoulders slumping. "Mike." "No, let me finish," I interrupted, my heart pounding. "I read what you said. I get it. You love him." She didn't deny it. That hurt more than anything else. She just nodded slowly, her eyes downcast, her voice barely a whisper. "Yeah. I do." There it was. The truth. I had been holding on to the hope that maybe this was all just some fleeting fantasy, that maybe she didn't feel as deeply for him as I feared. But hearing her admit it, out loud, made it undeniable. "How long?" I asked, my voice rough. "How long have you felt this way?" Laura sighed, running a hand through her hair. "It's been a while. I don't know exactly when it happened, but it wasn't intentional, Mike. I never meant for any of this to happen." "But it did," I said, my voice cold. "It happened, and now here we are." She looked at me, her eyes filled with guilt and sadness. "I'm sorry, Mike. I really am. I never wanted to hurt you." "Then why didn't you stop it?" I asked, my anger finally bubbling to the surface. "If you didn't want to hurt me, why didn't you just stop?" Her face crumpled, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in her resolve. "I don't know. I don't know why. It just happened. One day, I realized that I had feelings for him, and I couldn't ignore them. And by then, I didn't know how to stop it." I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "You didn't even try, Laura. You didn't even try to stop it. You just let it happen." Her voice cracked as she spoke. "I didn't want it to happen. But things between us, they haven't been right for a long time, Mike. You know that." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, I know. I know I screwed up. But I've been trying, Laura. I've been trying to make things right. You were the one who checked out." "You're right," she admitted, her voice small. "I did check out. But it wasn't just because of you. It was me, too. I let things get to this point." I turned to face her, my anger still simmering beneath the surface. "So, what now? You're leaving me for him?" She didn't answer right away. Her silence was deafening, and I felt my chest tighten. "I don't know," she finally said, her voice shaking. "I don't know what I want anymore." I stared at her, incredulous. "You don't know what you want? You're in love with him, Laura. How can you not know?" "I love him," she said quietly. "But I love you too, Mike. It's not that simple." I laughed again, the sound hollow. "It's not simple because you made it complicated. You've been living two lives, and now you're stuck in between." She wiped her eyes, frustration and sadness etched into her features. "I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you what to do, but I don't even know what to do myself." I sat down, the fight draining out of me. I had nothing left. "So, what? You're just going to string us both along until you make up your mind?" Laura shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "No. I can't do that. I know I need to make a choice, but I need time, Mike. I need time to figure out what's right." Time. That's what it always came down to, didn't it? Time. Space. As if time alone could fix everything. But as I sat there, staring at the woman I had loved for over a decade, I realized something. Time wasn't going to fix this. No amount of time would change the fact that she had already chosen someone else, even if she couldn't admit it to herself yet. You've already made your choice, I said quietly, standing up. You just don't want to say it out loud. She looked at me, confusion flashing across her face. What do you mean? I mean, I said, my voice steady, that if you loved me enough to stay, you wouldn't be in love with him. You wouldn't have let it get this far. Laura opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came. She knew I was right. I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me as I walked toward the door. You need time to figure things out. Fine. Take all the time you need. But I'm done waiting. I left her sitting there, silent and unsure, as I walked out of the house, my heart heavy but my mind clear. I didn't know what was next. But I knew one thing for sure, our marriage was over. The divorce happened quicker than I had expected. Laura and I agreed that dragging it out would only make things worse for both of us, and most importantly, for Ben. We went through the motions, signed the papers, divided our assets. There wasn't much of a fight. Maybe because by the end, we were both too tired to care anymore. Laura moved in with Roman shortly after everything was finalized. I didn't ask many questions, and she didn't offer much information. I knew they were serious, but I didn't want to know the details. All I cared about was making sure Ben was okay through all of it. We arranged joint custody, and for the most part, things were civil between us. We had to keep things that way for Ben's sake, even if there was still tension between us. Life moved on, albeit in a different direction than I had ever anticipated. The house felt emptier without Laura in it, but eventually, I got used to the quiet. I focused on work and on spending time with Ben whenever I had him for the weekend. The ache of losing Laura faded slowly, and before long, I realized I no longer felt anything when I thought about her. She was just the mother of my son now, nothing more. About a year passed. By then, Laura and Roman were living together full-time, and from what I could tell, things were going fine for them. I wasn't keeping tabs or anything, I just heard bits and pieces from Ben, who spent time at both of our homes. He never seemed to have any complaints about Roman, which was a relief. As long as my son was happy, I didn't care what Laura and Roman did. Then, one evening, out of the blue, my phone rang. It was Laura. I stared at the screen for a moment, confused. She rarely called me unless it was about Ben or something practical. We communicated mostly through texts these days, keeping things short and to the point. But this was different. Hello. I answered, unsure of what to expect. There was silence on the other end for a moment, and then I heard her voice. It was shaky, strained. Mike, I don't know who else to call. My stomach tightened. What's going on? It's Roman, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was in an accident. I felt a strange mix of emotions swirl inside me, shock, confusion, and, if I was being honest with myself, indifference. I didn't care about Roman. I never had. But I knew that this wasn't about him. This was about Laura. Is he okay? I asked, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He's in the hospital, she said, her voice cracking. It's bad, Mike. They don't know if he's going to make it. There was a long pause as I processed what she was saying. I didn't know what to feel. The man who had been the reason for the end of my marriage was now fighting for his life, and here I was, on the phone with the woman who had chosen him over me. It felt surreal. What do you need from me? I asked, my voice steady. Laura took a deep breath. I just need someone to talk to. I don't know what to do. I'm at the hospital now, and everything's a blur. I didn't know who else to call. I'm sorry. I closed my eyes, leaning back against the wall. I could hear the desperation in her voice, and as much as I didn't want to get involved in her life again, I couldn't ignore the fact that she was the mother of my child. I couldn't leave her to deal with this alone. Do you need me to come to the hospital? I asked, already knowing the answer. Yeah, she said softly. If you can. I don't know how to handle this on my own. I'll be there soon, I said, grabbing my keys from the counter. Where are you? She gave me the name of the hospital, and I hung up the phone, sitting for a moment in silence before heading out the door. I didn't feel much for Laura anymore, but I knew I had to be there for her. Not because of some lingering attachment, but because she was Ben's mother. That was reason enough. When I arrived at the hospital, I found Laura in the waiting room, sitting in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs, her hands clenched together in her lap. She looked up as I walked in, and for a moment, I saw the vulnerability in her eyes. She had always been strong, always in control, but now, she looked lost. Hey, I said softly, sitting down next to her. Thanks for coming, she whispered, her voice hoarse. I didn't know who else to call. I nodded. What happened? Car accident, she said, rubbing her temples. It was late, and he was driving home from a meeting. Someone ran a red light and slammed into his car. He's in bad shape, Mike. The doctors don't know if he's going to make it. I didn't know what to say. I wasn't good at comforting people, especially not her. But I could see how shaken she was, how scared she was. Despite everything that had happened between us, I couldn't help but feel for her. This wasn't about Roman anymore. This was about Laura and the fear she was facing, and I couldn't ignore that. How long have you been here? I asked. Since last night, she said, her voice trembling. I've barely slept. I can't leave him, but I don't know what to do. I feel so helpless. I nodded, leaning back in the chair. You don't have to do anything right now. Just wait. The doctors will do what they can. She looked at me, her eyes filling with tears. I'm sorry, Mike. I know I shouldn't be dragging you into this. I just didn't know who else to turn to. It's fine, I said, my voice calm. I'm here. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation pressing down on both of us. I wasn't here for Roman. I was here for Laura, even if my feelings for her had long since faded. She was the mother of my child, and no matter what had happened between us, I couldn't turn my back on her when she needed help. The hours passed slowly, the sterile hospital waiting room filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the occasional footsteps of nurses. Laura barely moved from her seat, her eyes fixed on the door to the ICU, waiting for any news about Roman's condition. I sat beside her, not saying much, but my presence seemed to bring her some comfort. At one point, she rested her head in her hands and whispered, "What if he doesn't make it? What am I supposed to do?" I didn't have an answer. There was no easy way to comfort her, no promise that things would be okay. All I could do was sit there, next to her, and wait for whatever news was coming. It was strange, being back in her life like this, even if only for a moment. We weren't the same people we had been when we were married, and I knew that no matter what happened with Roman, I wasn't going to get pulled back into her orbit. But that didn't mean I could walk away from her either. She was still Ben's mother, and I still had a responsibility to be there for her, even if we were no longer together. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally came out to speak with Laura. She stood up quickly, her hands shaking as she listened to him. I watched from my seat, the weight of the situation sinking in even deeper. Roman was in critical condition. He had survived the initial surgery, but there were complications, and his chances were still uncertain. Laura nodded, trying to stay composed, but I could see the fear in her eyes. As the doctor walked away, Laura turned back to me, her face pale and drained. "I don't know what to do, Mike. I don't know if I can handle this." "You don't have to handle it alone," I said, standing up and putting a hand on her shoulder. "I'll stay here with you, as long as you need." She nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. Thank you. In that moment, despite everything that had happened between us, I realized that some bonds don't just disappear with a divorce. Our marriage was over, but our lives were still connected in ways that couldn't be undone. I didn't love Laura anymore, but I would always care about her. And for now, that was enough. Roman didn't make it. A few days after the accident, despite the doctor's best efforts, he passed away in the hospital. I was there when it happened, sitting quietly next to Laura as she processed the news. She cried, hard, deep sobs that shook her body, and I just sat with her, holding her hand, trying to offer whatever support I could. It felt strange, surreal even, to be there with her through this, but I couldn't leave her to face it alone. After Roman's death, things changed quickly. Laura needed time to grieve, and Ben stayed with me full-time while she dealt with everything. I didn't press her for details or ask too many questions. I knew this was a lot for her to handle. She had lost someone she loved, and even though that person had been the cause of our marriage ending, I couldn't deny the weight of what she was going through. Weeks passed, and Laura eventually asked if she could come by more often to see Ben. It seemed natural at first, she needed to reconnect with him, especially after all the chaos. But then she asked something that threw me off completely. "Mike," she said one evening, her voice tentative. "I was wondering if, maybe I could stay here for a while." I remember looking at her, completely taken aback. "Here? At the house?" She nodded, biting her lip. "I know it's a strange request, but with everything that's happened, I don't know where else to go. I need to be close to Ben, and being alone in the apartment reminds me too much of Roman." I didn't know what to say. The idea of Laura moving back in after everything that had happened felt strange, almost wrong. But at the same time, I could see the pain in her eyes, the exhaustion etched into her face. She was struggling, and I couldn't turn her away. "Yeah," I said, my voice hesitant. "I guess you can stay here for a while. It might be good for Ben to have you around." She smiled softly, her relief evident. "Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate it." And so, Laura moved back in, at least temporarily. I told myself it was just for Ben, that I was doing this because he needed his mother around. But as the days passed, things between Laura and me started to shift in ways I hadn't expected. She was different now, softer, more vulnerable. She was still grieving, but there was a tenderness in the way she interacted with me, a gentleness that hadn't been there for years. We started spending more time together, not just as co-parents, but as two people sharing a house, a history. At first, it was small things, watching TV together after Ben went to bed, talking about old memories. It felt oddly comfortable, like slipping into an old routine that we hadn't realized we missed. And then, one night, things went further than either of us expected. It had been a long day. Ben was at my mom's for the night, and Laura and I were sitting on the couch, talking about nothing in particular. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but at some point, the conversation slowed, and we just looked at each other. There was something in her eyes, something I hadn't seen in years, desire, longing, maybe even regret. Before I could think too much about it, Laura leaned in and kissed me. It wasn't hesitant or awkward. It was soft, familiar, and for a moment, I forgot about everything that had happened between us, the divorce, the affair, Roman. It all faded away, and I kissed her back. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were in the bedroom, tangled in the sheets like we used to be. It felt natural, almost too natural, and for that night, it was easy to pretend that everything was okay, that we were still the same people we had been when we first got married. But the next morning, reality came crashing back. I woke up early, the sunlight filtering through the curtains as I lay there, staring at the ceiling. Laura was still asleep beside me, her hair spread out on the pillow, her breathing slow and steady. For a moment, I thought about slipping out of bed and pretending like nothing had happened. But I couldn't. We needed to talk about this. I got up and made coffee, trying to gather my thoughts. By the time Laura came into the kitchen, I was ready. She looked at me, a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty in her eyes. I motioned for her to sit down, and she did, wrapping her hands around the mug of coffee I had set in front of her. "Laura," I began, my voice steady but careful, "we need to talk about last night." She nodded slowly, her expression guarded. "Yeah, I know." I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "What does this mean?" "I mean, what are we doing here?" Laura looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the rim of the mug. "I don't know, Mike. I really don't." Her answer didn't surprise me, but it didn't make things any easier. "It's just, we've been through a lot. And last night, was that just a one-time thing? Or are you thinking about something more?" She sighed, rubbing her temples. "I'm still trying to figure that out. I didn't plan for it to happen, but it felt right, didn't it?" I couldn't argue with that. It had felt right, in a strange, complicated way. But I couldn't ignore the reality of our situation. "Laura, I need to be honest with you. I don't know if I can go back to how things were before. So much has happened between us, and I don't know if we can just start over." She looked up at me, her eyes filled with a sadness that cut deep. "I know, Mike. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I'm not asking for that. But, maybe we can find something new. Something better." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. Could we really start something new? Could we build a life together again after everything we had been through? "I don't want to hurt you, Laura," I said quietly. "And I don't want to confuse Ben either. We need to be careful about this." She nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I know. I don't want to hurt him either. But Mike, I don't know what I would have done without you these past few months. You've been there for me in ways I never expected. And last night, it reminded me of what we used to have." I felt a lump form in my throat. "But it's not the same, Laura. We're not the same people anymore." "No, we're not," she agreed softly. "But maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it means we've grown." Her words were hopeful, but I couldn't shake the feeling of uncertainty that gnawed at me. This wasn't just about rekindling old feelings, it was about rebuilding trust, about figuring out if we could really make this work after everything that had happened. "I need time to think about this," I said, my voice low. "We both do." Laura nodded again, her eyes filled with understanding. "I get it, Mike. I'm not asking for an answer right now. I don't want to lose you again." We sat there in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation hanging heavy between us. Neither of us had the answers, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we were at least on the same page. I didn't know where things would go from here. There were still too many questions, too many unresolved issues. But I did know one thing, I wasn't ready to let go just yet. Not after everything we had been through. The house was quiet, almost too quiet, as Laura and I sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The early morning sunlight filtered through the window, casting soft shadows on the floor. We'd had the conversation I dreaded the night before, and I knew we couldn't avoid the inevitable much longer. I had spent the night tossing and turning, replaying every word, every glance, trying to figure out how to make her understand. The truth was, no matter how much we had shared in the past or how close we had become over the last few weeks, things between us couldn't go back to the way they were. They couldn't move forward either, at least not in the way she hoped. Laura sat quietly, sipping her coffee, her eyes distant. I could see the weight of everything that had happened between us etched on her face: Roman's death, her grief, the complicated web of emotions that had drawn us back together for one night. But that night had been a mistake, and it was time to make that clear. I cleared my throat, breaking the silence. "Laura, I've been thinking about last night, about us." She looked up at me, her expression guarded. Yeah. I can't do this, I said, my voice steady but firm. I can't pretend that we can go back to how things were or start something new. It's not fair to either of us, and it's not fair to Ben. Her face fell, and she set her mug down, her hands trembling slightly. Mike, I wasn't asking to go back to the way things were. I just thought, maybe we could find something new, something better. I shook my head, trying to keep my emotions in check. Laura, we can't. What we had, it's over. And after everything that's happened, I don't think we can build something new. Not like this. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she quickly wiped them away, trying to keep her composure. But last night, it felt real, Mike. It felt like we were connecting again, like maybe there was still something between us. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. It was a moment, Laura. A moment of comfort, maybe even familiarity, but it doesn't change anything. We've both moved on in different ways. You were in love with Roman, and I've come to terms with the fact that our marriage ended a long time ago. Her eyes searched mine, looking for something, anything, that might give her hope. But I couldn't give her that. I couldn't give her false promises. I don't want to hurt you, I continued, my voice softening. But we need to be honest with each other. The only thing we share now is Ben. He's the most important thing in both of our lives, and that's what we need to focus on, being good parents to him. But as for us, there's nothing left. She looked away, her shoulders slumping as the reality of my words sank in. For a long moment, she didn't speak. Then, she took a deep breath, her voice barely a whisper. I understand. The sadness in her voice hit me harder than I expected, but I knew this was the right decision. There was no future for us as a couple, no matter how much we cared about each other or how much history we shared. I'll move out, Laura said quietly, standing up from the table. I'll start looking for a place as soon as possible. You don't have to rush, I said, trying to offer some comfort. You can stay here for as long as you need to figure things out. She shook her head, her eyes resolute. No, I think it's better if I go sooner rather than later. I need to move on, and so do you. I nodded, watching her walk toward the bedroom to start packing her things. A part of me wanted to follow her, to tell her it didn't have to be this hard, but I knew it would only make things more complicated. This was the right thing to do, for both of us. A few hours later, Laura stood at the door, her suitcase in hand. Ben was still at my mom's for the weekend, so there was no need for an emotional goodbye between him and Laura. She would see him in a few days, and everything would go back to the way it was before she moved in. She turned to face me, her eyes red from crying but filled with determination. Thank you, Mike. For everything. I gave her a small nod. Take care of yourself, Laura. We'll figure this out, for Ben. She smiled weakly, then turned and walked out the door, leaving behind a final sense of closure that I didn't know I needed until that moment. As the door clicked shut, I stood in the silence of the house, my mind finally clear. This was the end of our story, and I was at peace with that. There would be no new beginning for us, no rekindling of old flames. What we had was gone, and I had finally accepted it. But one thing remained, we would always be connected through Ben, and that was enough. I didn't need anything more.